And now, welcome to the Jewish Quarter in Rome. 5 centuries ago, in the spot seen in the picture, there stood a walled ghetto. Its gates open at dawn and close at dusk, separating the city's Jews from the rest of its population in a cramped 7-acre area. The ghetto was established in 1555 by Pope Paul I, bounded by the stone and by prejudice. Over the next 300 years, Italian Jews built 2 main streets, 3 piazza, and 4 small squares in this tiny area. As the population gradually grew, they had to keep adding extra floors atop of their building with annex construction protruding in every direction, which made the ghetto extremely crowded. Today, there is a small piazza called Cinque Scholar in the Jewish Quarter. But can you imagine that by the 1870, there was a religious school, a rabbinic college, benevolent aid society, and 5 small synagogues were all hidden in this small area. A great many people gathered here, and it was a vibrant hub for their religious life. After Rome became part of Italy in 1870, Jews were eventually allowed to leave the ghetto. By 1885, Rome's city officials believed that the appearance of the ghetto influenced the image of the city, so they began to demolish buildings in this area. In 1904, the Italian Jewish community poured their resources to build the Great Synagogue on the ruins of the old ghetto. The Great Synagogue is a powerful declaration of how Italian Jews acknowledge and honor their unique heritage. Its architecture mixes Roman, Greek, Egyptian, and Near East elements, reflecting Italian Jews' honor in their ancestors' journey from ancient Jerusalem to modern Italy. Inside, it displays the traditional tablets of the law and the 7-branched menorah, which is placed higher than the curved menorah on the nearby Arch of Titus that celebrates Rome's victory over the Jews. This menorah reflects Italian Jews' proud message: we are still here and have not been defeated yet.
Nevertheless, the Great Synagogue still preserves elements from Italian Jewish history. For one, the rite, or nusach, is Italian. That is, it is neither Ashkenazi or Sephardi. Even though reports from Professor Jalen state that attendance is low, the preservation of this rite through continuous ritual prayer reflects both the general Jewish stubbornness, for one, but also, in this case, specifically Italian stubbornness, to ensure that this continues, even if for tourists or temporary guests in Rome. Perhaps more revealingly, though, parts of what the Grand Synagogue replaced in the ghetto were preserved and incorporated into the new building. Namely, there's a Sephardic synagogue in the basement, as we saw, and it utilizes parts from one of the 5 synagogues that used to exist in the ghetto. In this way, modern Italian Jews can at once celebrate their emancipation, especially after World War II and the Shoah, their persistence as well in the ghetto and in Rome, and acknowledge and continually use their ghetto past, since, after all, this is an active synagogue. Though, of course, there is the often question of how often is this option used. Indeed, this synagogue, the Sephardic one, is in the basement, and perhaps this reveals the preferences of the Italian Jews, as we read much about, and their large assimilation and sort of declining rates of synagogue attendance. Another site in Rome that reflects modern Italian Jewish understandings of their heritage is the Rose Garden, and it confirms many of the previously mentioned notions and observations. In 1952, the Jewish community consented for their old cemetery, which is where the Rose Garden is today, to be turned into the municipal Rose Garden. But maybe as a compromise or something like this, it kept roughly in the shape of a menorah. Of course, this was after the cemetery had already been somewhat defiled by Mussolini's urban planning in the 1930s, and there's lots of history there, like improper exhumation of bodies. But the agreement to, after World War II, essentially complete this transformation is perhaps signals an extreme desire to assimilate, to move away from the ghetto, or just to develop good relations with the local government after the terror of World War II. And indeed, many dead bodies, from my understanding, still remain there. and thus the menorah, a particularly ironic symbol in Rome with the Arch of Titus, rather than the sacred and divine regulations about the dead, very, very important ones, became the preferred expression of identity. The menorah in this rose garden became the preferred expression of physical existence, of real estate in Rome. The Roman Jews thus, in some ways, through this rose garden, appropriately reflect their heritage of confinement, of persecution, and of extreme desired assimilation and acceptance in the Roman community today.
Despite Italian Jews have lived in Rome for more than 2,000 years and built a rich and unique heritage, there is one memory that modern Italian Jews pay extremely attention to preserve, which is the Holocaust. The trauma of that period have already mixed into every street of the Jewish quarter. As you walk through the neighborhood, you will be struck by how deeply and thoughtfully the community remembers and honors that painful memory. All around the quarter, you will find carvings depicting scenes from October 16, 1943, the day when the Nazis came and took more than 1,000 Jews in the community away. Many scars from that event are carefully preserved. For example, some doors that were damaged by Nazi violence have been deliberately left unrestored, serving as permanent reminder of the past. Moreover, in front of almost every residential building, you will also notice some small tiles embedded in the ground. Each one records the name, date of birth, date of being captured, and fate of a Jewish resident in the community. These tiles were created by the German artist Gunther Damin, who launched the project in 1992 and intended to bring back the names of millions of Jews suffered during the Second World War. The inscriptions on these tiles are very small, and it is hard to read the text when stand upright. When Italian Jews stopped to look at the tiles, they would instinctively bend over rather than just squat down, a small gesture that also showed their profound respect. Moreover, if you joined a guided tour of the Jewish quarter, your Italian Jewish guide will very likely point out these tiles alongside other religious landmarks, such as temples from the 12th century CE and the Great Synagogue. This reflects that for Italian Jewish community, the memory for the Holocaust is just as important as their religious heritage. Thanks for watching halfway through our video. Learning new things can take a lot of energy, so now it's time for refill yourselves with some Italian Jewish food. These dishes not only taste delicious, but also perfectly show how modern Italian Jews both acknowledged their unique heritage and try to fit into the Italian society. In the 19th century, Italian Jews began gaining citizenship and civil rights. However, this emancipation came with a cost, which is Jews were expected to give up many of the things that made them different to fit into the Italian society. This often meant no longer obeying their religious traditions, such as keeping kosher and attending service at the synagogues. By the early 19th, religious traditions among Italian Jews had greatly declined. Things started to change in 1931 when Ernest Benedetti published the first Italian Jewish cookbook, Hidden Poetry. After this, a self-consciousness renewal of Italian Jewish culture began. The renewal movement acknowledged their Jewish heritage rather than rejecting it, and it tried to find new ways to combine their Jewish identity with Italian identity. One of the ways they found was developing new Italian Jewish food. Since then, Italian Jewish food started to focus less on keeping kosher, but more on preserving cultural memories and family traditions. Moreover, Italian Jews also started organizing their meals according to the additional Italian structure of 4 or 5 courses. Instead of adding extra courses, they often combined several courses into a single one, or simply double or triple the main course. The adaptation of the traditional Italian food structure helped make Jewish food more recognizable and respected in the broader Italian society. At the same time, it allowed Italian Jews to proudly acknowledge their heritage while claiming their place as Italians. Through their food, they found a way to balance both parts of their identity.
Speaking of food, a key culinary institution in Roman Jewish and, more specifically, perhaps paradoxically, in Italian Jewish life is the restaurant chain plainly known as the ghetto, translated to in the ghetto. Though internally, to us, it might be the butt of various jokes from either overfeeding us or underfeeding us, the ghetto proudly and profoundly reflects numerous features of Italian Jewish existence, heritage, and survival. In Rome, the ghetto is actually more than just the restaurant we dined at with Professor Chabelle. It also owns another restaurant on the block. It owns a milk restaurant and a bistro restaurant, and thus is a total of 4 restaurants in just Rome. Then, of course, it also has locations in Florence, which I've walked past when I visited, in Venice, which we went to for a Shabbat meal, and in Milan, which I have yet to go to. I cannot speak to the latter, but in those other cities, specifically Venice and Florence, Baguetto is just one of 2 kosher restaurants in the cities. That is, for any Jew, whether residents or tourists, who desires to keep kosher and wishes to eat out, Baguetto is half of their options, of their 2 options. As we know, it is located in the Roman and Venetian ghettos. And in Florence, it's basically located in what used to be their ghetto. There isn't really one anymore, but it's across the street from the synagogue. And the other kosher restaurant is right next to the synagogue. That is, the name of Baguetto is indeed appropriate and, accurate. It's in those ghettos. But what does this represent? For one, the name, and more importantly, the restaurant itself, with restaurants being an inherently modern institution, especially with regards to class aspirations of the middle class and post-emancipation life, not only remind of the existence and history of the ghetto, but they affirm and uphold the existence of the ghetto. That is, the restaurant is not only a reminder of the ghetto, but continues and ensures its survival. In addition to the synagogues, they are invariably and obviously nearby, the ghetto and its duopoly draws observant Jews to the ghetto for all of their meals. But as with the Venetian synagogue that we attended, diners will notice that both of their fellow attendees to this site, a perhaps ritualistic site given the immense ritual surrounding any Jewish meal, are also tourists. In addition to the name, the restaurant explicitly advertises itself, often in English, as uniquely providing Roman Jewish cuisine. Baguetto thus upholds the ghetto primarily as a site for Jewish community for Jewish tourists. This modern institution preserves Italian Jewish heritage, with admittedly more emphasis on the latter, namely with regards to the dietary laws of kashrut, but for other, often non-Italian Jews. Baguetto is first and foremost a pseudo-nostalgic institution, one that packages an imagined ghetto life, even if the institution exists out of necessity for just providing kosher meals for Jews. It also has this nostalgic, touristic spin and slant. It is thus notable that despite its significant presence in Rome, where Jewish life is by far the largest in Italy, it is still outnumbered by many other restaurants, kosher restaurants in Rome, whereas in Venice and Florence, cities very much designed for and pretty much exclusively catering towards tourists nowadays, it is just one of 2 options. Of course, though Rome, as stated, contains the oldest and largest Italian Jewish community, it was and is not the only Jewish community on the Italian peninsula, perhaps precisely because this peninsula, after the fall of the Roman Empire, was not unified until the 19th century. Thus, accordingly, mechanisms of remembrance vary between these different communities. One such community, and a very historically important one, is that of Venice, with its ghetto pictured here. Like Rome, the preservation of the ghetto as the city's center for Jewish life, even if the majority of Venetian Jews now live outside of it, demonstrates a desire to preserve this heritage of the Venetian ghetto. It is a heritage of Jewish presence in Venice dating back to at least the 12th century. Notably, though, the ghetto, which was the very first ghetto to exist, that's what gave the name of ghetto, was instituted
only in the 16th century, in 1516, after the League of Cambrai, which was attacking Venice, destroyed much of the mainland Venetian possessions, and Jews living in mainland Venice, since the majority of them were only allowed to live in mainland Venice and not the city, then sought refuge in the city after the destruction of the League of Cambrai. Already, though, key distinctions have to be made here. There wasn't really just one ghetto. Indeed, Venice never really had a unified Jewish community. Different waves of Jews with different levels of wealth and influence made their way to Venice at different times. Thus, predictably, these groups kind of lived in their own so-called mini ghettos, if you want to coin a little term, with synagogues corresponding to their background. There was a German synagogue, a French synagogue, an Italian synagogue, a Spanish synagogue, and the Levantin synagogue. That's not exactly in chronological order, but just to give you, these were the five, and these were the rites that they followed. Additionally, while Jews were normally prohibited from expanding horizontally, and indeed, as we saw, the skyscrapers, these multi-story buildings with very low ceilings, reflect that prohibition of horizontal expansion, as these waves of Jews came in, the Venetian government actually allowed the ghetto to expand somewhat, but it was still confined to the same island, but they sort of just annexed extra land and expanded the gates. But perhaps counterintuitively, after this point, after this confinement to the ghetto, after all the Jews of Venice came into the ghetto, this began the Venetian Jewish Golden Age. And eventually they would have Christian audiences. It became very cheap, it became very hip to attend Jewish services, to have Jewish friends. And they had stately audiences with emperors and dignitaries. They achieved extremely high levels of education, not just in Jewish education, but in subjects like Latin and Greek. And they had the wealth to show for it with all sorts of fancy and decorations and whatnot. Nowadays, when you look at it, however, the wealth seems to have dissipated. Yet the synagogues, and only those synagogues, remain. As David J. Goldberg states, a Venetian legend claims that though the Jews gained their freedom after Napoleon's conquest to move out of the ghetto, they no longer had strength to do so. So thus, clearly after the Venetian Golden Age, something had changed, but the ghetto remains. Although the Jews don't live in the ghetto, almost precisely because it's too expensive in the center of Venice, similar to Rome. Perhaps then, the fact that these synagogues remain and still somewhat operate, the two of them, the Spanish and Levantin, are continually used, alternating seasonally, depending on the temperature. These synagogues persisting are testament to the strength that still existed in the Venetian Jewish community. And indeed, the other three synagogues that are not in continuous use are still, as we heard, continuously maintained and undergo lots of restoration work, which obviously reflects a desire for a dignified preservation. You don't restore the synagogue if no one is going to be using it unless you expect that it will be used at some occasion, or, more accurately, that people will be touring it and seeing it, that it will be presented to other people. It is thus worth briefly examining the exterior and especially interior design of these synagogues. Immediately, as you'll notice from the outside on the facades, all the synagogues are roughly clandestine. Though there are some obvious tells, such as the number of windows, only recently installed plaques of the Star of David might somewhat more clearly mark this as a synagogue. Otherwise, they essentially look like other buildings in the areas. These facades, therefore being kept plain, offer a somewhat original, let's say, but obviously they've been cleaned over time, sober contrast and a reminder of the history of marginalization to the splendid, often unparalleled, often somewhat strange interiors. For example, in the Italian synagogue, the bima was 20 feet high, and thus far more akin to what one would find in a church, given the theological nature and assumptions of Christianity as opposed to Judaism. Or take the Aron HaKodesh in the Spanish synagogue, where our tour guide pointed out that the rays around the tablets and crown at the top are clearly inspired by motifs in Christian art and not Jewish ones. Or take their general usage of marble, at times disallowed and at times permitted, depending on the Venetian relationship with the church and general Jewish-Christian relations. That is, in all of these cases, the synagogues are preserved in a state that reflects a history of conflict, assimilation, and of accidental or ironic adoption of extrinsic norms, and of a unique form of exile, one that was at once detestable, but also fruitful. Indeed, it would appear that the whole ghetto, as it exists today, despite its inherent contradictions, these contradictions being the preservation of clandestine facades, the Christian or incorrect interior design of the skyscrapers, even though you can build horizontally now, although not really because Venice is super packed, of the ghetto itself, being a contradiction due to people having freedom and no longer even living there. All these contradictions are fundamentally, just like Baguette, the restaurant chain analyzed earlier, are an expression of deep nostalgia. Steporin, the author of the essay about Italian Jewish food and assimilation and culture and expressive culture that we read earlier, quotes Samuel David Luzzatto, a descendant of a very famous Venetian rabbi, of Luzzatto worrying about Jewish emancipation and the destruction of the ghetto, severing the Jewish bonds which sustain Jewish identity and its understanding of prosperity. We should recall that almost all of those praying at the synagogue were not Venetian Jews, but tourist Jews. The ghetto, therefore, is now that bond for the Jewish community. Perhaps I go too far, but in line with Yerushalmi's understanding of Jewish history as assimilating events to old and established conceptual frameworks, this site of the ghetto represents a recognition of a new event, of going beyond this established framework. It is the impossibility of returning to a pre-emancipated life. The ghetto and its preservation for tourists and its active usage by tourists represents a desire to link to this moment in history, but at once a deeper understanding of a newer historical experience of Jews. The ghetto's destruction is not lamented in the way of a temple, nor is it celebrated like another Jewish holiday, but if I could go so far as to say, represents a sort of new type of Jewish experience of wanting some link, of wanting some experience of this Jewish past that is recognized as, and perhaps, regardless, an unwanted, an undesirable past that should not be returned to, but nevertheless be remembered.
Now, a final musing related to the Venice ghetto, prompted by our own first-hand experience. How does security mediate the relationship between Italian Jews and their cultural heritage? As we walked the ghetto last week in Venice with the intention of shooting film for this video, the local security told us off for filming outside the Spanish synagogue. This short footage shot on my fisheye lens documents this happening. You may be able to catch the security guard wag her finger at Jacob briefly. I tried my luck in the Spanish synagogue's garden afterwards, which we discussed earlier. Despite having previously met the woman at the door, who actually happened to be our tour guide a day or two ago, I was not allowed in. This whole experience got us thinking about how the security environment, that is, the presence of armed guards, barricades, military police, and a general air of precaution, influences the perception of Italian Jewish cultural sites, as well as the cultural integration of Italian Jews themselves. We have talked about food as a symbol of integration into the Italian society at large. But perhaps the physical architecture of Italian Jewish ghettos can be interpreted in a contrasting manner. The architecture of the Italian Jewish ghetto indicates that it must be protected, which is a reaction to the long and more recent history of anti-Semitism, but also an overarching symbol of difference at a high level. This protection has two knock-on effects. On one hand, security is needed to ensure that Italian Jewish institutions are not destroyed. On the other, this necessary act of securing our cultural sites reduces the ability and perhaps willingness of Italians, both Jews and non-Jews, to visit them. In a sense, this security is the modern embodiment of the Pope's guards, who were stationed outside the gates of the Roman ghetto, which, in a perverse sense, did protect those inside, with the difference that the Italian military presence is, of course, no longer paid for by the Jewish community, but the papal guards were. Relatedly, security changes the built environment. The Italian Jew grapples with barricades, metal detectors, and the like, which interrupt daily life. But these changes, of course, as we've discussed, are necessary. Thus, the push and pull between security and accessibility will likely continue to favor the former, at least for the foreseeable future. We can only hope for a day when Jews are admired rather than persecuted for their differences which persist in Italy despite the high degree of cultural integration of the Jewish community.